Well, my clock says that it's one after, and we do have some people still trickling in. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. We have an exciting second half here. I hope you all enjoyed your break. For those who don't know, I'm Dan Stark, and I'm the Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Agent for the North Coast, covering Clatsop, Tillamook, and Lincoln counties, more towards the Central Coast down there. And I'm stationed up here in Seaside in Astoria, specifically. I'm also the Tillamook and Clatsop Tillamook chair. So I am going to be the moderator for this session, and we are now going to start talking about and moving into people, communities, and trees, one of my favorite topics for sure. And we're going to go ahead and just get underway. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker to get us started today. Is Dr. Paul Ries. He's the director of the graduate, Dr. Paul Ries, excuse me, yes, is the director of the Graduate Certificate in Urban Forestry program at Oregon State University, where he serves as a senior instructor teaching online courses in urban forestry and arboriculture. Paul holds both a BS and MS degrees in natural resources and a doctorate, I forgot I read that part earlier, in educational leadership. He has over 35 years of experience in the natural resources and urban forestry fields, working at the state, local, and nonprofit and academic levels. Previously, he served as the Urban and Community Forestry Program Manager for the Oregon Department of Forestry, as the Executive Director for the Pacific Northwest chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture, as an urban forester for the city of Cincinnati, Ohio, and for 15 years, he held a national Type 1 qualification as a public information officer for wildfire incidents in the Western United States. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today, and thank you very much. Go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Dan. That was a long introduction, but that's all right. Thank you for inviting me to present today. The topic that I'm going to address is an idea of reframing trees, leveraging the lesser understood benefits of urban trees, and you might say forest as well here on this particular topic. I will give you a brief PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll invite some questions on this particular topic. As Dan said, I've spent about the last 35 years working in urban forestry, natural resources, and wildland fire. I did start my career out as a traditional forester, actually. I was a tree farm inspector, and I was secretary of SAF's working group back in the early 90s. I eventually sort of moved my professional career into urban forestry, and actually ended up serving as president of the International Society of Arboriculture in 2017. If you're not familiar with ISA, it's similar to SAF. We have about 24,000 members worldwide, and a fairly large, extensive program of certification, qualifications, credentialing, and continuing education. As noted, I served 23 years on the urban forestry staff at the Oregon Department of Forestry before retiring in 2017, and I now work half-time at Oregon State. I teach a variety of different courses, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. For today's presentation, I'd like to talk about reframing people's understanding of trees and forests, and specifically my niche of the world is urban forests, and really discuss how we might do that in a strategic way and what that might actually look like. So let me start off with this photograph of my grandson from a few years back. When I take pictures of my grandchildren, and trust me, I have a lot of those, as most grandparents do. Typically, you take a head face-on shot of a child. But I was walking with young Micah. He was probably about 3 years old at the time. He's 9 now. But we were walking along, and the leaves were falling. This is along a street in Salem, and the leaves were falling, and he decided to start to catch them. And so I just pulled my cell phone out and snapped a photograph of him. And I think it's interesting. He's caught a leaf, and then there's another leaf falling by his shoulder there. In a normal way of approaching this photograph, I would have taken this straight on and so that you could see his face, but I think this tells a really interesting story by reframing how I took that picture and the perspective that this particular photograph offers. And I think it's illustrative of what we need to do as foresters and as urban foresters, is reframe how people think about trees and forests. As mentioned, I worked for over 20 years in wildland fire, and including 10 years on one of ODF's incident management teams as a lead public information officer. And of course, you're all familiar with the fire triangle, the three things you need for fire. And I kind of adopted this for communications as well. And I actually give a talk about how to talk about trees and how not to, about navigating this fire triangle. So I want to introduce it here. I'm not talking about it today, but just so you kind of think about this, is that if we're going to be effective communicators of trees and forests, we need to navigate this triangle of the key message, the target audience, and the proper tool. So we have to ask ourselves, what key messages are we using? Are they the right ones? And are our efforts being strategic enough to advance public understanding of trees and forests? And I would say that for most of us, we struggle with this area. We do a great job talking to each other, but sometimes getting that point across to the public isn't as rewarding or isn't as relational as we'd like it to be. We were to think strategically about the benefits of trees. You perhaps heard the saying, trees are good, and we were to look at all the benefits that we get from trees, whether they are the environmental, the economic, or the social benefits of trees, whether they're the wood products that we get or the natural beauty that we appreciate. Most people would agree that trees are good. But in reality, trees are really great. In my realm as an urban forester, the things that I work with is helping people understand the value of the trees right around us, the forest where we live, and all of the extrinsic and intrinsic benefits that we get from trees that contribute to our quality of life. So I would argue that most people know trees are good. They inherently know we get clean things like clean air and clean water and toilet paper and furniture and whatever else. But by and large, most people don't have a clue that the trees around them have a positive net influence on their personal health, for example, or that their neighborhoods are healthier because of the presence of trees. So this is what I believe is our job as foresters, is to communicate this type of information. So what do I mean by reframing trees? Well, the word reframe, it's a verb that basically means changing the way that you look at something and thereby changing your experience of it. So in my world, I tell people I think we need to reframe how we advocate for urban trees, and I would go for forests as well, how we describe the benefits of trees, and then how we communicate and engage people with them as well. The photograph here, I think, illustrates a little bit about this point. You have a tree in a home landscape that has been topped, which of course is the worst thing that you can do to a tree. And there is two child swings suspended from about 2 inches from the end of that topped off limb, but yet the adjacent homeowner wants us to slow down as we drive by, because theoretically they say we love our children. And, for me, I think the interesting part of this is they love their children enough to make them want you to slow down, but not enough for them to care for that tree properly and to not put a swing on what is functionally now a hazard tree. So that just sort of goes to the disconnect that people have with their understanding of trees. If we're going to reframe our understanding of trees, I think we have to start with our why. If you've not ever watched Simon Sinek's 2009 TED Talk, I would encourage you to take a look at it. I don't have time to show you a clip of it today, but basically Sinek says people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And he says for the way most people communicate, they communicate the what rather than the why. So I think we have to look at why we dedicate our lives to being stewardships of good forestry, and why people should care about why that we manage the forest properly and their connection to trees and forests. So if we're going to communicate that, we have to understand the connections that people have, and they vary from the economic, environmental, and social that I mentioned earlier, or even to the spiritual and emotional. But I think that what people tend to connect with is really the power of a story. Let me give you an example of this. One of my favorite classes as an undergraduate, more than 35 some odd years ago, was silviculture. And I remember Dr. Heiligman strolling into the classroom one day and picking up a piece of chalk. And yes, I'm dating myself here. This was pre-internet days, no PowerPoint, didn't exist. And Randy picked up a piece of chalk and he said, before we get into tree planting techniques, I'm going to talk to you about how to plant a balled and burlap tree. Now, most of us in a traditional forestry class had no idea how to plant a balled and burlap tree. But what Randy told us was that someday someone's going to find out you're a forester, and they're probably not going to ask you about multiple use or sustained yield or rotation. They're going to ask you how to plant the tree in their yard. And so he proceeded to diagram on the chalkboard how to plant a balled and burlap tree. And that's always stuck with me. And it was kind of funny because I ended up moving into urban forestry. And, those are the kind of trees I planted were large landscape trees instead of seedlings in the woods. But that story really always stuck with me, that he would take the time out of a silviculture class to remind you that when someone finds out you're a forester, they're going to want to know about the trees right around them, not just the trees in the national forest or in a tree farm or out in the rural areas. So here are 3 reframed stories of trees and forests I think that we need to tell. The first is that trees provide benefits we can't live without. The second, that trees make and save us money. And 3, that trees make or break our communities. Trees provide us benefits we can't live without. This is not just a saying, it's really a fact. It's a matter of established science. There is so much research out there that tells us how important trees and forests are to us. The questions we have to ask ourselves as urban foresters and foresters are why community decision makers don't realize this and act accordingly and don't have the supportive policies for forestry that really, I think, are equitable to the importance that they have in our lives. There are so many research studies that I could quote here, but let me just quote one of them for you. A research study done in the city of Philadelphia a number of years back showed that trees actually reduce our stress levels. So by viewing a green vacant lot, a pocket park, if you will, people had a significantly decreased heart rate, and than they did if they were in a non-green, non-treed vacant lot. So this research suggests that there's a biological link between green and the reduction of acute stress. You're going to hear more about studies like this from Dr. Jeff Donovan, our next speaker, my colleague who does a fantastic job in communicating why trees are so important to our public health. There are so many ways, and I just put these all together in a list for you. These are all the myriad of ways that research has shown how trees influence our health, either our physical health, our psychological health, or our social health. If I had the time, I would give you a study for each one of these. You can look this up on your own. You can listen to Jeff tell you about a couple of those. But these are the type of benefits that we get from trees that most people, again, don't really know about. I mean, how many people think that that trees can influence birth outcomes? Those are the kind of things that researchers are discovering these days. Number 2, trees make and save us money. I always tell people that when they think about it, trees make more financial sense than most investments. When you plant a tree, whether you harvest that tree or whether you benefit from the shade and all the ecological services that those trees provide, that those trees are providing a greater rate of return than you can get virtually anywhere else, including the stock market. Because trees allow us to avoid spending money because of the services they provide. So for example, in an urban area, when we plant trees, we know that slows down rainwater and stormwater runoff. That allows us not to have to build such big pipes to take the water out of sight and out of mind. Here's some research that was done worldwide that showed in the 10 largest megacity metropolitan areas on 5 continents, An international team of researchers found that trees provide over $500 million worth of these economic, environmental, and social benefits that we call ecosystem services. If it can do that in a mega city, what can it do in Philomath or in John Day or in LeGrand? It's an economy of scale, but all of it happens in all of the cities across all of Oregon and all the other states as well. Number 3, trees can make or break our communities. Research has shown that trees correlate to positive social outcomes, and the lack of trees correlate to negative outcomes. Whether we look at areas that are a sea of macadam, like the former Kmart store here in Salem on the left, or the trees outside of the football and baseball stadiums in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, on the right here. The trees in our communities have an impact, and they have a positive impact. Yes, they have a cost, but if you were to add up all of the costs of planting and pruning and maintaining all of the urban trees, you'd find that the cost benefit ratio is about $2.70 to the good for planting trees and for managing trees in our communities. Similarly, lack of trees is really an environmental justice issue. A study by my colleague, Dr. Vivek Chandas at Portland State University, of 108 cities showed the relationship between the present day pattern of urban heat islands to the historically racist practice of redlining. If you're not familiar with redlining, it existed from about 1934 to about 1974. And it was the official government policy of denying investment to minority and economically disadvantaged communities in large cities. And if you overlay maps of those redline areas and the heat island areas today and the lack of canopy, and I'll show you one in a moment, there's a consistent pattern for these historically underserved urban areas. Here's Richmond, Virginia, for example. So if you look at two census tracts, the one on the left and the one on the right, you see the one on the left is in a green area that's got a lot of canopy. The area on the right that is in red has low canopy and was historically redlined. Look at the chart on the right side of the screen that talks about the health and socioeconomic data found today. If you look at social vulnerability, life expectancy, poverty, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, and pulmonary disease, everything's higher in areas that don't have trees. So we can understand that there's a legacy here. There's a legacy of neglect. There's a legacy of non-investment in these communities that hasn't just been economic. It's been public health. It's been social aspects as well. So when we think about trees and reframing how we converse about trees, these are the kind of things that we as urban foresters think about. It's not just the rural forest, it's the urban forest that people benefit from. Now, there's a saying, I told you trees are not just good, but they're great, but they're not perfect. You know, we understand that we have to manage trees. And sometimes in urban forestry, we make the uncritical assertion that everybody likes trees. But, you know, there are disservices and trade-offs in managing the urban forest. If we don't manage the urban forest properly, we get things like hazard trees, and we get increased tree risk, and we get the ability or the risk of trees falling and endangering people and property. You know, those are disservices, and so we need to recognize that. Just as there are services, there are disservices in what it is we do. But ultimately, the argument for managing urban forests, for paying attention to the benefits that trees and forests provide, it's really all about our health. And it comes down to the health of our economy, the health of our community, and the health of ourselves as humans. And this, my friends, I think is the story that we as foresters have to be able to tell. It's not just about our little niche. It's about the broad impacts and the broad benefits that trees and forests provide. So here are 3 strategies I think that we need to think about in terms of if we're actually going to reframe trees and reframe forestry in the minds of people. The first is we have to reposition trees as being essential in our society. We have to advocate for that tree equity I mentioned, and we have to foster community engagement. Now, the recent pandemic that we've been through in the last couple of years has caused a lot of people to think about resiliency and what is essential. Well, I don't think there's a whole lot more that's essential than trees and forests in our lives. I mean, when you think about it, they're essential for our health, for our livability, for our well-being, and even for their safety in cities. And if you could think about this for a second, that if you looked at everything and you've lived through the pandemic now and all kinds of regulations and lockdowns and policies and mandates, can you think of one thing that not a single one of the 50 states declared non-essential? If you guessed lottery tickets, you guessed right. So how do we make trees and forests as important and as essential to people as lottery seems to be? Number two, I think we need to advocate for tree equity. The benefits of urban forestry particularly have not been equally distributed. As I mentioned, that redlining has left cities hotter and with less tree cover than today. And this has resulted in things like the tree equity scorecard. This is an effort by the conservation group American Forests, has developed a tree equity scorecard. And you see, this is the scorecard for Corvallis here. So Corvallis's tree equity scorecard runs from about 23 up to about 98. And you can look in this particular area just north of downtown Corvallis, not too far from the OSU campus, has a tree equity score of 38. And if you look on the left, you see that it also has a higher percentage of people in poverty. It has a higher percent or a higher mean temperature because of that lack of trees. So you can go to treeequities.org and look at the neighborhood you live in and figure out what that tree equity score is for you. So here's another one to compare. In Northwest Corvallis, they have a tree equity score of 96. And if you look at that, the 0% employment, 7% people in poverty. So there's a dramatic difference between areas that have trees and areas that don't. Let me go back to that. 38% with a 6% canopy cover, 96 score, they've got a 42% canopy cover in that neighborhood. So this kind of explains the type of data that you can garner from this tree equity scorecard, and you can look up the community where you live and do these sorts of analyses. And then finally, number three, I think fostering community engagement is really vital if we're going to advocate for trees and forests in an effective way. Now, community engagement is kind of a bit of a trendy term. You'll see it popping up a lot more. But basically, in its simplest terms, it's about better engaging communities to look at long-term sustainable outcomes, processes, and relationships where trees and forests are involved. And I think that all too often, people have been excluded or plans have been developed and then presented to people for acceptance rather than getting them in on the ground floor and helping them understand what role they play in advocating for trees and forests. I think the keys to community engagement really for us as foresters is working collaboratively with and through different groups of people, and whether that's affiliated by geography or interest, but thinking about forests and trees as crucial and integral to our quality of life. And we go back to that why question. We have to ask ourselves, why do we engage? Who do we engage with, and how? And one of the challenges we have, I believe, as foresters and urban foresters, is making trees and forests more relevant to people, helping them understand that it's not just when a wildfire hits or when a storm hits that they need to pay attention to trees and forests. It's all the time, because it's whenever we have a case to engage them and to bring them into our realm and to help share our knowledge with them. So we look to the future, and as I conclude here, I think we need to think about things like climate variability, population growth and density, and diversity and inclusion in helping people grasp this need to reframe our understanding of trees and forests, and to move towards a more forest and tree literate society, because people don't know what they don't know. And that as foresters, And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as foresters to share that knowledge and share that information and help people understand this idea of the lesser understood benefits of trees and forests. Because ultimately that is our challenge as foresters, is to make trees and forestry more relevant to more people if we're going to be successful in managing not just the forest in the rural lands, the forest in the urban areas, the forest where we live, and helping people understand why trees and forests are more important to them. So it really requires us to help them make connections that they might not immediately make. And, really the amount of research that demonstrates this information is just staggering, but still underappreciated. I remember when I started out my career as a forester back in the mid 1980s, we knew trees are good. We knew that trees provided all these benefits, but we knew it anecdotally. And the amount of research that has occurred in the last 35, 40 years is really just staggering, that proves all these points. And if we're going to be successful, we need to be able to communicate that research in a way that helps people understand it, digest it, and adopt it as something that they're willing to believe in and to act accordingly with. Well, I thank you for attending today, and appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. And I've got a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. That was fantastic and very interesting. We do have a question here for you waiting, and I'd like to have a question too if people don't chime in here. Folks, this is your chance to write in your questions in our Q&A box. Lots of interesting things brought up here to start off this new section. This is from Bob Alvert. He asked, well, first of all, he says, excellent presentation. There are some human health issues not addressed in your talk that are very important. One, a sizable number of people have major ear, nose, throat problems associated with tree pollen allergies, mold and fungal allergies, and experience significant negative health effects caused by trees, as well as many other plant species. The second, have you looked into this and acknowledged this in your work and presentations? Three, also some tree species have greater negative effects than others. Do you have info to help guide folks on tree selection options? So three, let's break it down there. So back to the first question, I'll remind you again here, and this is written down here though, a sizable number of people, have these issues with tree allergies and stuff like that. And so let's see, right.
Yeah, yeah, I could jump into that, Dan. So I think the aspect of this is, the answer is yes, and that's part of that disservices. Remember, I told you trees are great, but they're not perfect. Okay, that is an issue that people need to be aware of. There are certain people at certain times of year, there's certainly disservices to being around trees, and we have to help acknowledge that and kind of help manage that. As far as the presentations that I do, I do mention this, is that trees are not perfect. There are disservices involved. And yes, there are some species that have negative impacts, particularly when you get into invasive species, for example. And so, there's the whole, in urban forestry, we deal with this idea of right tree, right place. And I think I saw Steve Fitzgerald on here earlier. Steve Fitzgerald and I have an extension publication out through OSU called A Guide to Selecting, Planting, and Caring for a New Tree. You can look at that in the extension catalog, and that provides information to people on what trees to plant for various reasons and how to properly plant them.
Great. And so then they were wondering also if you've used this in any of your work, and let's see, do you have any help to guide folks on tree? I guess you just did tree selection options. Yeah. There is that guide there, and we use that all the time in extension. That's such a great resource. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something, actually, I should mention that Steve Fitzgerald from my OSU colleague and I did that as a printed publication. We actually have an iPad version of it, a graphic version of it with some videos that he and I shot a number of years ago when we did a revision of that particular document. So I would kind of direct you to that. That probably is we try to get that out through the OSU Master Gardener program, for example. There's Steve. And then we try to do, we try to help people understand that. And the idea behind that particular publication is, just as when you buy a car, you get an owner's manual for your car. Now they're online, but they used to be these thick books that were in your glove box. And Steve and I developed that publication essentially as an owner's manual for, for somebody buying a landscape tree to help them work through all those particular issues.
Great, thanks, Paul. That is all the questions that we have here, and we are right about time. So if any more should happen to pop up, we'll keep monitoring this Q&A section. So maybe you can keep an eye on that if you wanted to type in some answers to those questions. Thanks again, and round of applause here for Paul. Thank you. We can't do that virtually too well. Thank you so much. Okay.